Okay, so industrial supremacy. We want to talk about how industry is fueling Western development, but also how Western development is fueling industry. I want us to keep those ideas in our head. We'll be talking about the key concepts that are related here in another little assignment. But industrial supremacy is going to be our focus for the next little bit, how the United States is gaining its industrial power. So, why is industry growing in the United States during this time period? First of all, there's an abundance of raw materials. And where are we getting those raw materials? Largely, we're getting them from out west. We also have a growing population, both American born population and also immigrant population is growing during this time period, which means that we have a growing supply of labor. And remember, what's in large part attracting that immigration? It's the growth of industry. What's fueling the growth of industry? It's this ready supply of labor. So it's all connected here. Movement out west, immigration, growing industry. There are also federal policies in place that promote the growth of industry, things like a high tariff. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imports. The higher the tariff is, the more that's going to protect American industry because it makes foreign imported goods more expensive and American made goods yet less expensive. So when a tariff is very high, it's called a protective tariff because it's literally protecting American businesses. But remember that the other side of that coin is that high tariffs can oftentimes hurt consumers because in the end, consumers are paying more for a product. Because of the tariff. It can also hurt farmers because they are oftentimes selling their goods overseas and they will have their items, their produce slapped with the tariff in return. The gold standard is in place. So when we talk about metal standards, what we're referring to here is this idea that greenbacks or paper money, they used to call them greenbacks, have to have something backing them to give them value. And during this time period, gold is giving greenbacks value. The laissez-faire philosophy is also in place. Laissez-faire is this idea of hands-off, that the government is going to have a hands-off approach when it comes to regulating industry. And so we just see growth happening here on a really large scale with not much to slow it down. And the federal government is also subsidizing the growth of railroads, which remember is furthering that growth out west, furthering access to raw materials, and then in turn furthering industrial growth. Railroads are also customers for this steel, for example, being produced. Let me enlarge this. You also have someone named Frederick Winslow Taylor, who is going to publish something in 1911 called The Principles of Scientific Management. And in this, he's known as the father of scientific management, and his ideas are collectively known as Taylorism. But in his Principles of Scientific Management, he lays out 4 things that help improve or make business more efficient. And you're going to start to see these things pop up here in industrialism. And later on, when we talk about, I'm sorry, my phone was ringing and distracted me. When we talk about populism and progressives, like for example, Teddy Roosevelt is a progressive president, one of the things that progressives want to do is promote efficiencies in government, efficiencies in business, efficiencies in general. So we're starting with that idea here. We are definitely not to the progressive era yet, but I just want to introduce that concept. So first of all, replacing the rule of thumb work method with scientific study of tasks. So you want to make sure that there is a scientific foundation or reasoning behind why you are doing certain tasks, certain things in certain order. You want to scientifically select, train, and teach, as well as develop the employee, as opposed to the employee choosing their own work and training methods. So you want to standardize things and say, this is how we do things here, this is how everyone is going to do things. You want to provide detailed instructions and supervision of performance, as well as cooperation with employees to ensure that methods are followed. And the 4th one is to provide for equal distribution of work between management and labor, where management will assume the role of planning using the scientific methods, and then of course labor will execute. Ford's assembly line is another good example of efficiencies being established in the industrial era, building a car quickly on an assembly line, and also something called the Bessemer process, which has to do with steel. And I've got a short little, I've got a short little video clip for you on the Bessemer process.
Making steel in massive quantities was one of the great technological challenges of the Industrial Revolution. But it turns out that the secret to creating this mega material was known as far back as 300 BC, when it was made in India and Sri Lanka. The trick to creating this metal was in getting the exact right combination of steel's two main components, iron and carbon. But today, steel is everywhere. So how did it become the workhorse of the modern world? The answer is Henry Bessemer. Bessemer was a British scientist who in 1856 figured out an efficient way to turn iron and carbon into steel. He did it by using hot blasts of oxygen inside a specialized furnace to reduce the amount of carbon in the metal.
The Bessemer process made steel production far more efficient than it ever had been in history.
If you want to make good, high-quality steel, you blow pure oxygen through the iron, and this oxidizes the carbon that is in the iron.
With temperatures over 2,000 degrees, the oxygen is literally burning the carbon out of the steel. Every day, 17,000 tons of iron ore pours into the furnaces at the ArcelorMittal Steel Mill in Cleveland, Ohio. And each year, this sprawling 1,000-acre facility single-handedly cranks out enough raw steel to build a train track around the globe.
This plant is the most efficient integrated steel plant anywhere in the world. There's always a hot stove on line.
Foundries like this one use extreme heat and heavy machinery to blast away impurities from the iron ore and infuse carbon, creating a metal stronger, more flexible, and less dense than iron. Turning low-grade ore into the most used metal in the world starts at a 200-foot tall furnace. This is where the iron ore is hit with heat generated by a type of fuel called coke.
Coke is the result of burning the impurities and the junk out of coal that you don't need to get to the good stuff, which is going to burn cleanly and give you the nice, hot, clean fire that you need to make steel.
It's called the blast furnace because as the ore and coke flow downward, they're met by a 1,600-degree blast of hot air moving at 110,000 cubic feet per minute.
The wind is coming in at what we call the Bosch level of the furnace through nozzles, which are called tuyeres, and we have 18 of them, depending on the size of the blast furnace. That air is pushing up through a solid burden material.
The superheated air ignites the coke like charcoal in a grill and heats up the furnace to nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the oxygen is finally blasted away, leaving pure molten iron. But it's also doing something even more amazing. As the heat from the coke flame strips away the oxygen, the carbon in the coke is bonding to the iron.
You have hot blast going in, you have the material going in at the top of the furnace, and it's melting, and as it's melting, it's going down.
Under the extreme heat, the mixture liquefies. Impurities like silica and sulfur rise to the top. The heavier iron sinks to the bottom, where it's drawn out in a glowing molten stream.
The furnace until it turns into liquid, and it comes out the tap hole.
Every 45 minutes, some 500 tons of molten metal, called pig iron, gushes from the tap. It's called pig iron because it was originally cast into molds resembling piglets suckling a sow. But ironically, though the iron has been freed from the oxygen, the molten pig iron that flows from the furnace has a new problem: too much carbon. Over 4%, which makes the resulting metal much too brittle. To become steel, that number needs to be reduced to less than 2%.
It's all one continuous process.
We want a very specific strength level. We need the carbon in a very critical range.
To get it right, the carbon-loaded pig iron must undergo one final treatment in the oxygen furnace. Inside this iron cask, the molten steel, already at more than 2,000 degrees, is blasted with jets of pure oxygen. The molten steel ignites the oxygen, only this time the fuel isn't coke. It's the actual carbon atoms bonded to the iron. Basically, the molten material itself is burning.
We flow 25,000 cubic feet of oxygen per minute into the bath in the vessel. The oxygen reacts with the carbon and reduces the carbon level.
The longer and hotter it burns, the more the carbon burns away. The molten metal that pours from the chamber is now a perfect blend of soft iron and brittle carbon. A metal that is strong but ductile, hard but malleable, and forms into solid glowing slabs, ready to span rivers and plow through the ocean. This is steel. But the steel is still red hot, with a temperature over 1,000 degrees. So the metal is transferred to a series of casters and rollers, where it's cooled with water and reduced from 75,000-pound 9-inch slabs to a ribbon just 3/4 of an inch thick. The entire furnace process takes just 2.5 hours to turn the natural mined substance of iron ore into the world's most widely used high-strength metal.
We're very proud. Without us, a lot of stuff can't be made.
Okay, I just find that fascinating. So at the end there, when they're saying, how do you turn this natural raw material of iron ore into these like thin little plates of steel that can be used to make, everything that we see in our industrial world today, essentially. This is the process, this Bessemer process. This is an efficiency, right? So it's the link between the raw material and industrialization, and this is exactly where we're heading in this chapter. Railroads. Remember, so the Bessemer process has to do with how you turn iron ore into steel, and the steel industry is crucial to American industrial development. It's the thing. It's concentrated in western Pennsylvania as well as eastern Ohio because of the high prevalence of iron ore and also coal. With the growth of the steel industry, railroads will emerge to support its transportation. How do you move iron ore, right, and steel around? You use it with railroads, but it also is being fueled by the railroad industry because you need steel to make railroad tracks, railroad cars, everything that you can think of. The oil industry is also going to be created by the emergence of railroads. And this is a pretty cool map here, the growth of railroads to the far left, 1850, 1860, and 1880. We've looked at a few of those other maps before, but most of them have been concentrated on how railroads have grown out west. Here you can really see how they have grown in the northern Midwest as well as the Northeast, and we're going to be looking at that website separately. Okay, some SAQ practice that we have in our folder. Many contend that the growth of the railroad was a significant turning point in U.S. history. A, identify and explain one specific piece of evidence that supports this claim. B, identify and explain a second piece of evidence that supports this claim. And C, explain the element of U.S. history most impacted by the growth of the railroad. We will work on this short answer question, but go ahead and be thinking about how you might answer that. Okay, corporations. This is crazy to me, okay? So this is the wealthiest people during the unit that we're studying and what their net worth would be today, okay? So today, Rockefeller would be, these are the four wealthiest. Rockefeller would be worth $418 billion. To put that into context, the wealthiest person now, Jeff Bezos, was listed at $179 billion. Carnegie, $372 billion versus Bill Gates, $111 billion. Ford, $200 billion versus Mark Zuckerberg at $85 billion. Vanderbilt, $200 billion versus Warren Buffett at $73.5 billion. This all just sounds like play money, right? But by 1892, there are more than 4 million millionaires in the United States. These four are going to be the wealthiest of those living at the time, and they are manufacturers, right? Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, Vanderbilt. Rockefeller is going to pioneer the idea of a trust. When we get to the progressive era, we start talking about trust busting and monopolies. This is going to be something that Rockefeller is really going to begin the idea of. He's going to not be the one to perfect the idea of the trust. That will be J.P. Morgan. He will really take this concept and run with it. But essentially, a trust is when stockholders in smaller companies will sell their stocks to trustees in exchange for a share of the total trust profits. It's smart. But there are questions about whether or not it's legal because you're going to concentrate industrial power in the handful of just a few people when you have a trust, and that could be dangerous to competition. Now, right now, because of laissez-faire, there really is no big brother in terms of the federal government looking over businesses or corporations' shoulder and saying, should you do that? Can you do that? What do we do if something goes wrong? And remember that without competition, companies can charge whatever they want to for goods and services. Just a little bit of a breakdown in terms of who we're thinking of here. And the title of this little image here, it says Big Business Barons. So a lot of times you will hear Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Vanderbilt referred to as robber barons. We're going to look at some political cartoons to that effect as well. Robber barons is not a nice phrase, right? Because it implies that they're getting rich off of the backs of others. We're getting rich when maybe they shouldn't be. But if you think about, like, for example, the tenement houses that we've looked at, that's how most people in cities are living. And then you contrast it with the billions of dollars in today's money that these men had. It's a very startling contrast. And so it drew a lot of criticism that they were living too well, right? So Rockefeller, he is in the oil industry with the Standard Oil Company, which starts just as a small refinery and absolutely grows. Carnegie, the steel industry. He was a former telegraph operator who will form Carnegie Steel Company, and Vanderbilt with shipping. He will begin to invest, though, in railroads during the Civil War, and he will dominate both the railroad industry and the shipping industry. J.P. Morgan is someone I want to add to this list. He's a banker. He worked to create an integrated steel industry, and he will purchase Carnegie Steel for $450 million, as well as other smaller steel companies, and then combine those steel companies to create U.S. Steel, which will control 2/3 of the nation's steel production. So when we say that Rockefeller sort of started the idea of a trust, but J.P. Morgan perfects it, they're referring to the acquisition of Carnegie Steel and others. Okay, so vertical integration. You might have noticed on the last slide, there's two terms here that we want to think about: vertical integration and horizontal integration. And it's how a lot of these robber barons are making their money. Vertical integration is most associated with Andrew Carnegie and Carnegie Steel. In a situation of vertical integration, a company will take over all of the different industries and businesses associated with a certain category of business. So, for example, Carnegie Steel owned the mines. It owned the railroads that were transporting the steel. It owned the smelting factories. And then finally, it owned the refinery and the rolling factories. So from all stages of production, Carnegie Steel was involved. So if you look at that image on the bottom left, you can see exactly what we're talking about. It owned everything from the time that the iron ore came out of the ground. It owned that mining process, and then all the way up through the Bessemer process when those rolls of steel were produced. So that is what vertical integration is. So from the coke fields down to the railroads, all of that is owned by Carnegie Steel. It owns all phases of steel production. Now, keep this in mind for when we talk about labor unions and strikes, because if you have a strike at any one of these phases, what is that going to do to steel production in the country? And if you have a company as giant as Carnegie Steel, and as important to the U.S. economy as Carnegie Steel. If Carnegie Steel is shut down due to a labor strike, what does that do to the industrial growth of the whole nation? So keep that in mind. That's Andrew Carnegie. Okay, horizontal integration. This is going to be most associated with John Rockefeller. Horizontal integration, I blew this up and I made it blurry just so that you guys could see it. It has to do with combining a number of firms engaged in the same enterprise into a single corporation. So he owned like all of the refineries, the oil refineries, right? So all across. He doesn't own from the drill to the sale and distribution, but he owns all of the refineries. All of that one single band of integration. Here is just another way of looking at vertical versus horizontal integration. Okay, so if you've got questions about that, just reach out and let me know. I think I'll stop here for now.